my mother-in-law, measured a person's worth in carats and bloodlines. So I decided to teach her the value of a single, well-placed secret. It wasn't a quick lesson. It was a 3-year masterclass in demolition. She just didn't know she was the building being brought down. My name is Jessica, and for a very long time I was nobody. That was the point. It was my greatest protection and ultimately my greatest weapon. Before I became the architect of Patricia's ruin, I was a woman who preferred foundations to facades. My father taught me that. He was a quiet man, a titan who wore flannel shirts and preferred the company of his library to a boardroom. The world knew him as Richard Sterling, a name synonymous with a global empire built from dust and sheer force of will. I just knew him as Dad, the man who taught me how to read a blueprint, how to spot a load-bearing wall, how to understand that the most important parts of any structure are the ones you can't see. We lived in a world of immense wealth, but he raised me to see it as a responsibility, not an identity, a tool, not a trophy. Our home was a sprawling testament to his success, but it was a quiet place. Lonely even. The silence in those long corridors taught me to listen, to observe. While other girls from my world were learning which fork to use, I was learning how to gauge the structural integrity of a deal by the sweat on a CEO's brow. My father's world was a chessboard, and he taught me to see 10 moves ahead. Not for ambition, but for survival. He wanted me to have a life of substance, so he shielded me from the gilded cage he had built. My own path led me away from his empire and into the past. I became an architectural historian. A ridiculous profession, Patricia would later call it. A dusty, pointless hobby. But to me, it was everything. I found beauty in the bones of old buildings, in the stories held within their walls. I understood that to truly know something, a cathedral, a fortress, a family, you had to understand its foundation. You had to know where the cracks were. It was this passion that led me to David. I met him at a fundraiser for the university's preservation department. He wasn't there for the history. He was there for the future. He was trying to secure seed money for his company. He was electric. He spoke with a fire I'd never seen in the sons of my father's contemporaries, men who inherited their ambition along with their trust funds. David was different. He was the son of a family whose name meant something in the stale, insular world of old money, but he was fighting to build a legacy of his own, separate from the stagnant manufacturing firm his father ran. He didn't want the family name. He wanted to earn his own. That was what I fell in love with. Not his charm, not his looks, but that drive. That fierce, desperate need to prove he was more than his lineage. He saw me, really saw me, not as a potential asset, but as a person. He loved that I could talk about Roman aqueducts for an hour. He loved that I didn't care about the label on his suit. He saw substance. Our courtship was real, grounded. Away from the worlds we were both trying to escape. In his small apartment, surrounded by takeout containers and business plans scribbled on napkins, we were just us. And it was there, in that sanctuary, that we made the pact, the one condition for our life together. He knew my father was comfortable, but he didn't know the scale. I told him I wanted it to stay that way. For his family, my background had to be a blank page. No last name that rang bells, no talk of the family business. Just Jessica, the architectural historian from a modest background. It wasn't a lie, not really. It was an extension of my most authentic self, the self my father had cultivated. But I did it for David. I wanted him to succeed on his own terms. I didn't want the shadow of my father's name to touch his ambition, to taint his victory. I didn't want his family to ever think he had married for money. It was an act of love, a sacrifice to protect the one pure thing he was trying to build. He agreed, he was grateful. He thought it was noble. Neither of us understood we were forging the blade that would one day be pressed to our own throats. And then, I met his mother, Patricia. Even her name felt like a perfectly preserved antique, beautiful, cold, and utterly untouchable. She was the self-appointed queen of a shrinking kingdom, the matriarch of a family whose influence was fading like an old photograph. Her entire life was a performance, a desperate, exhausting performance of superiority designed to mask the terror that her world was becoming irrelevant. She saw life as a ladder, and she would kick down anyone who dared to climb up from below. From the moment she looked at me, I was not a person. I was a problem to be solved, a blemish on her perfect family portrait. My hands were wrong, not manicured enough. My dress was wrong, last season's cut. My profession was wrong, intellectual but not profitable. My family was wrong, lacking a name she recognized. I was a walking, breathing symbol of everything she feared, the dilution of her precious bloodline. Her cruelty was an art form, practiced not with a shout, but with a whisper. A surgeon's scalpel, not a butcher's cleaver. It was in the backhanded compliments. "Oh, that dress is lovely, Jessica. So brave to wear something so simple." It was in the feigned concern. "David, darling, are you sure Jessica is comfortable here? She seems a little overwhelmed." It was in the way she'd tell a story about some disastrous marriage to a social climber, all while looking me directly in the eye. For years, I endured it. I played the part she had assigned me, the meek, grateful, slightly bewildered commoner who had won the lottery by marrying her son. I smiled at her insults. I nodded at her condescending advice. I became a ghost at her dinner table, a silent observer in the corner of her lavish parties. David saw it. He fought it in his way. He'd argue with her in hushed, angry tones in the other room. He'd defend me, hold my hand under the table, apologize endlessly in the car on the way home. But he was trapped. She controlled his access to the family's network, the funding for his business, the very air he breathed in that world. Her love was a currency, and he was perpetually in her debt. I didn't hate her for it. Not then. I pitied her. She was a dragon guarding a pile of ash, so blinded by the sparkle of her treasure that she couldn't see it was worthless. Her power was an illusion, built on the fear of people who didn't realize they could simply walk away. I believed our love, David's and mine, was the real power. I believed we could outlast her, that our quiet, authentic life was the fortress she could never breach. I was wrong. I had miscalculated the depths of her insecurity. I had underestimated what she would do to protect a dying legacy. The end began at Christmas. The annual command performance. Every year it was the same suffocating ritual. The same forced smiles, the same empty conversations. But this year was different. There was an edge to the air, a sense of finality. A lawyer was there. A man with a face like a tombstone, seated beside Patricia as if he were the guest of honor. I didn't know it then, but he was the executioner. After the joyless meal, Patricia stood, tapping a crystal glass with a silver knife. The sound cut through the room like a shard of ice. "A toast," she announced, her voice resonating with false warmth. "To family, to legacy, to ensuring that what we have built remains protected for generations to come." Her eyes found mine across the table. They were glittering, victorious. "Lineage is everything. It must be preserved, unblemished," the lawyer coughed quietly. He opened a leather portfolio and slid a single, thick document across the polished wood to David. My husband stared at it, his face pale. "As you all know," Patricia continued, her voice dripping with condescension, "David has brought someone new into our lives. And while we welcome Jessica, we must also be prudent. We must protect the family's assets from any potential complications." The word hung in the air. That's what I was. "So, with the full support of the family trust," she said, her smile widening, "we have made a slight revision. A clarification, really." She paused for dramatic effect, savoring the moment. "Jessica has been formally and irrevocably written out of the family will. She will not be a beneficiary, a successor, or a recognized spouse in any matter pertaining to the family's financial future." Silence. A profound, bottomless silence that swallowed the entire room. It was a masterstroke of psychological violence. It wasn't about the money. I had never wanted a cent of her money. It was about the public erasure. The declaration in front of the entire clan that I was nothing. A temporary guest. A gold digger who had been sniffed out and cast aside. She had stripped me of my dignity, my standing, my very identity within the family I had tried for years to respectfully join. I looked at David. His face was a mask of white-hot rage and gut-wrenching shame. He was powerless. She had done this to him as much as to me. She had castrated him at his own family's table, forcing him to watch as his wife was humiliated, forcing him to choose between me and his legacy. The other relatives just stared at their plates, their silence a chorus of complicity. They were all on her payroll. Their loyalty had been bought and paid for generations ago. In that one crystalline moment, I saw her not as a sad, insecure woman, but as a tyrant. And you don't reason with tyrants. The car ride home was silent. A thick, suffocating quiet filled with things we couldn't say. David was vibrating with an anger he couldn't release. He kept clenching and unclenching his fists on the steering wheel. When we finally got inside our apartment, our small, safe world, it all came pouring out. He wanted to cut them off, walk away from everything. His company, his inheritance, his name. He was ready to burn it all to the ground. "We'll sue them," he raged. "We'll fight it," I just shook my head. I already knew. Justice wasn't an option. The law doesn't prosecute cruelty. The family trust was an iron fortress, designed by generations of lawyers to be impenetrable. A legal challenge would be a long, expensive public war, a war Patricia would relish. She had unlimited resources. We had a struggling startup. She would bleed us dry in the press and in the courts, painting me as the vindictive interloper she always claimed I was. She would win. Justice failed inside the family, too. The next day, David went to confront her, alone. He came back hours later, defeated. The color drained from his face. She had given him the ultimatum. "Her or your funding," she had said. "Her or your access to the board. Her or your name. You can have the little historian from nowhere, or you can have the life you were born to lead. You cannot have both." She wasn't just cutting me out. She was trying to cut me out of him. That was her mistake. She thought she was presenting him with a choice. But she was giving me a cause, a reason. To walk away would be to admit defeat. To let her win. To validate her narrative that I was worthless, disposable. To let her believe that her brand of casual, systemic cruelty was an effective tool for managing the world. No. Injustice like that, so personal and so profound, cannot be left to stand. It has to be answered, not in a courtroom, but in the court of her own making, the world of status and power she so desperately revered. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about something my father once told me while we were looking at the blueprints for a skyscraper. He said, "Anyone can knock down a wall with a big enough hammer. The real art is to find the single stressed beam, the one critical point of failure, and just tap it. And the whole thing comes down on its own." Patricia had built her life like a skyscraper, all glittering glass and steel, designed to project an image of untouchable power. But I had been inside. I had spent years walking its halls, feeling the vibrations, listening to the groans the structure makes when no one is watching. I knew where the cracks were. I knew where the foundation was weak. She had written me out of her family's future. I decided then and there that I would dismantle her family's past. I would not use a hammer. I would be precise. I would be patient. I would become the architect of her downfall, and I would use her own pride, her own vanity, her own desperate need for control as my tools. She wanted to erase me? Fine. I would become so invisible that she would never see me coming. David wanted to burn it all down. I told him no. We would do something far more satisfying. We would take it all away from her piece by piece until she was left in the empty, silent ruins of the life she held so dear. And the most beautiful part? We would make her hand us the demolition charges herself. She had fired the first shot in a war she didn't even know we were fighting. And I was about to show her what it felt like to lose. Everything. Before I begin, let me be clear about what happened next. My revenge was not a single furious act born of passion. It was a siege. And the first rule of a successful siege is to know the fortress you intend to break. Patricia thought she had cast me out into the cold. In reality, she had given me the one thing I needed most, a perfect vantage point from the outside. She wrote me out of her will, so I wrote myself into her life as a ghost. A quiet, sad, pathetic little ghost that no one paid any attention to. And ghosts, you see, hear everything. A person can get used to anything. Humiliation, condescension, even erasure. But the moment you decide to fight back, you feel everything all over again. The wound becomes a map, and every insult, every slight, becomes a landmark on the path to retribution. The first phase of our war was silence. David, bless his heart, wanted to scream. He wanted to fight, to argue, to make them see the injustice. I told him no. I told him to give them exactly what they expected. A son browbeaten into submission, and a wife who was heartbroken but too weak to leave. We played our parts to perfection. He was distant with his mother, but obedient. I was a study in polite sorrow. I attended the obligatory family functions, a shadow in tastefully muted colors, never speaking unless spoken to. I was the living embodiment of her victory, and she loved it. Patricia preened. She would look at me with that insufferable mix of pity and triumph, convinced she had put the little nobody firmly in her place. That vanity was the first crack in her foundation. While she was busy admiring her own reflection, I was taking measurements. At her parties, I would volunteer to help the staff, collecting empty glasses. It gave me a perfect reason to drift through conversations unheard and unseen. I learned which of her friends were loyal and which were just waiting for her to stumble. I heard her husband, Arthur, on the phone in his study, his voice tight with stress, talking about supply chain issues. I saw the second notice for a property tax bill on her desk, tucked under a copy of Vogue. Trivial things, little threads, but I gathered them one by one. David was my partner in this, my co-conspirator. He had to live the lie every day, going to his parents' home, attending board meetings at the family company, pretending that his spirit hadn't been broken that Christmas. He would come home, his face etched with exhaustion and disgust, and we would sit in the dark. He would tell me about the numbers. The company, Atherton Manufacturing, was old. It had been a titan in its day, but it was complacent, inefficient, running on legacy contracts and a reputation that was fading with each passing year. It was vulnerable. David would feed me data, internal reports, sales projections, personnel files, and I would add them to my growing blueprint of their ruin. After 6 months of this silent reconnaissance, I had what I needed. A complete schematic of the Atherton family's world, its financial dependencies, its social rivalries, its structural weaknesses. It was time to call my father. I had never asked my father for anything like this before. Our worlds were separate by design. I laid it all out for him. The insults, the condescension, the years of quiet humiliation, and the final public severance. I told him about Patricia, about Arthur, about the company. I didn't ask for his help in a way a daughter asks a father. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I presented it like a business proposal, a hostile takeover of a life. When I finished, there was a long silence on the line. For a moment, I thought he might refuse, that he would tell me to walk away, that revenge was beneath us. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, calm, and colder than I had ever heard it. "Tell me what you need, Jessica," was all he said. "I don't want your money, Dad," I told him. "I want your expertise. I want your infrastructure. I want your ghosts." He understood immediately. My father's empire wasn't just built on concrete and steel. It was built on information, on leverage, on a global network of shell corporations, holding companies, and anonymous entities so complex that no one could trace them back to him. These were his ghosts. "The target is Atherton Manufacturing," I said. "The goal is not to bankrupt them, not yet. The goal is to strangle them. Slowly. I want them to feel the pressure, to start making mistakes. I want them to bleed and not know where the wound is." Our plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, corporate strangulation. Atherton Manufacturing relied on a handful of key suppliers for their specialized steel components. Within 2 months, 3 of those suppliers were acquired by an anonymous international investment group. That group, of course, was my father. The first sign of trouble for Arthur was a notice of a 10% price increase across the board. Then 15. Then 20. He scrambled to find new suppliers, but they were all mysteriously locked into new exclusive contracts. He was trapped. Next, we went after their talent. David had identified the 3 most critical people in the company. The head of engineering, a brilliant but underpaid woman named Sarah, the VP of sales, a charismatic shark named Marcus who held all the client relationships, and a logistics genius named Chen, who made their antiquated shipping network actually function. One by one, they were approached by a high-end executive recruiter working for a new, dynamic competitor. They were offered salaries that doubled their current pay, signing bonuses, and creative freedom they could only dream of at Atherton. Within 6 months, all 3 were gone. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Production quality slipped. Deadlines were missed. Marcus's departure was a bloodbath. He took his 3 largest clients with him to his new job. The new competitor, funded by a venture capital firm that was another one of my father's ghosts, started undercutting Atherton's bids on every major contract. Arthur was hemorrhaging money and talent, and he had no idea the attacks were all coordinated. He thought it was a run of terrible luck. Patricia thought it was a sign of her husband's weakness. The pressure on their marriage was immense. David would describe the arguments he'd overhear. She had no understanding of the business. Her only concern was how its failures affected her social standing. The cash flow problems meant she had to cut back. First, she sold a small vacation property, then a few pieces from her art collection. Each sale was a small death to her, a chip in the marble facade of her perfect life. But it wasn't a smooth process. There were moments I thought the entire plan would collapse. One of the shell corporations my father used to buy a supplier was almost exposed during a due diligence audit. It took his legal team working around the clock for a week to create a new layer of corporate obfuscation to hide the trail. Another time, Marcus, the sales VP we poached, got drunk at a conference and boasted to an old colleague about his incredible new offer from a company that seemed to have unlimited funds. The story got back to Arthur, who started asking questions. We had to dispatch one of my father's fixers to have a quiet conversation with Marcus, reminding him of the non-disclosure agreement he had signed and the severe penalties for violating it. He never spoke of it again. Each setback tightened the knot in my stomach. I wasn't sleeping. I was losing weight. I lived on coffee and spreadsheets. I was so immersed in the architecture of Patricia's destruction that I was forgetting to live my own life. David would try to pull me away, to take me to a movie or just for a walk, but I was obsessed. The project had consumed me. It was during this time, about a year into the siege, that I made the discovery that changed everything. The midpoint revelation. David had brought me a box of old financial records from the company's archives, thinking it might contain some useful historical data. I was digging through a decade's worth of expense reports and capital outlay files, mostly useless stuff. But then I found it. A series of payments stretching back 15 years to a consulting firm I'd never heard of, AP Strategic Solutions. The payments were large, irregular, and vaguely described as discretionary consulting fees. A quick search revealed that AP Strategic Solutions was a holding company registered in Delaware, with no public-facing presence. On a hunch, I asked my father to have his people dig deeper. 2 days later, he called me back. The sole proprietor and beneficiary of AP Strategic Solutions was Arthur, my father-in-law. For over a decade, he had been systematically embezzling money from his own family's company, funneling millions of dollars into a private account Patricia knew nothing about. But the real shock was why. He wasn't just greedy. The records showed that the money was then being used to cover massive losses from a series of incredibly risky private investments that had all failed. Atherton Manufacturing wasn't just stagnant and inefficient. It was a hollow shell. Arthur had been secretly draining its coffers for years to cover his own failures, all while playing the part of the dutiful, if somewhat incompetent, CEO. The company was a house of cards. And Arthur was terrified that one day Patricia would find out that the man she married was a failure. This was the critical point of failure my father had talked about. The stressed beam. Patricia's entire world was built on the foundation of the Atherton name and the wealth it represented. But the wealth was an illusion, a facade maintained by her husband's secret, desperate fraud. My plan had been to slowly strangle the company. Arthur's crimes gave me a way to decapitate it, but it also added a layer of moral complexity that I hadn't anticipated. Exposing Arthur would destroy him completely. It might even lead to prison time. Was my revenge against Patricia worth the utter annihilation of this sad, pathetic man? I thought about it for a long time. I thought about his complicity on that Christmas night, his weak silence as his wife erased me. He had stood by and watched her wield the knife. My pity for him evaporated. He was not a victim. He was her enabler. He deserved his fate. This discovery accelerated our timeline and opened a new front in the war. Social annihilation. Patricia's greatest fear wasn't poverty. It was irrelevance. It was being pitied. It was time to make her worst fears come true. Every social ecosystem has a queen bee and a contender to the throne. In Patricia's world, that contender was Eleanor Vance. The two women had a rivalry that was the stuff of legend, a cold war fought with charity donations and passive-aggressive compliments. Eleanor was the one person Patricia truly measured herself against. And Eleanor was about to become my unwitting soldier. We started subtly. An anonymous email to a well-known society gossip columnist, sent from a secure server in another country. It was just a hint. Hearing whispers that the Athertons might be facing a liquidity crisis. Might be worth looking into why Patricia had to sell her Warhol. The columnist, smelling blood in the water, started making calls. The rumor mill began to churn. David played his part brilliantly. At a country club brunch, he had a confidential and emotional conversation with a family friend he knew was Eleanor's closest confidant. He spoke of his father's stress, the company's struggles, his mother's refusal to curb her spending. He painted a picture of a family on the brink, all while pretending he was begging for discretion. By dinner time, the entire guest list of the upcoming hospital benefit knew that the Athertons were in trouble. The tipping point came at the annual art museum auction, the crown jewel of the social season. This was Patricia's stage. She was the chair of the event, and it was her tradition to open the bidding with an ostentatiously large purchase. I wasn't there to see it, but I heard about it from 3 different sources before the night was over. Her primary card was declined. Then her backup. She tried to pass it off as a mistake, a security flag from her bank, but the damage was done. The Whisper campaign had been validated in the most public way possible. Patricia Atherton, the woman who measured her life in acquisition, couldn't afford a painting. She went from being an object of envy to an object of pity. In her world, that was a fate worse than death. The invitations started to dry up. The fawning calls ceased. When she walked into a room, the conversation would dip to a sudden conspiratorial hush. Her power, which had always been an illusion built on the perception of wealth, was evaporating. This was when I hit my low point. The victory felt hollow. I had thought destroying her social standing would feel triumphant, but watching it happen, even from a distance, felt sordid. I was using the same tactics she used: whispers, rumors, public humiliation. I was becoming her. One night, David came home and found me just staring at my wall of notes, my blueprint of their lives. He looked at me, and for the first time I saw not just love in his eyes, but fear. Fear of what I was becoming. "Is this worth it, Jess?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Look at you, look at us. We don't laugh anymore. We don't talk about anything but this. We're letting her turn our home into a war room. Maybe we should just stop. Let it go." His words hit me harder than any of Patricia's insults. He was right. The revenge had become a cancer. It was eating me from the inside out, consuming all the good parts of my life, of my marriage. For a terrifying moment, I considered it. Just stopping. Walking away and letting the pieces fall where they may. We could move. Start over. We could be free, but then I pictured her face. That smug, triumphant smile from Christmas. I pictured her believing she had won, that I had been broken and had simply crawled away. I thought about the system she had created, a world where cruelty and arrogance were rewarded, and decency was punished. If I stopped now, she would have succeeded. She would have proved that people like her always win. I looked at David, at the pain and conflict in his eyes. I was doing this for him too, for the boy who had been emotionally blackmailed his entire life by a mother who saw him as an accessory. "We're almost there," I told him, my voice steadier than I felt. "We can't stop now. If we do, everything we've lost, everything we've sacrificed will be for nothing." He nodded, but the doubt lingered in his eyes, and in my heart. The plan was working perfectly. We were winning, but it felt like we were losing ourselves. I had lost my sleep, my peace of mind, and very nearly, the man I was doing it all for. I had become a mirror image of my enemy, cold, manipulative, and obsessed with a victory that felt more like a sentence. But I wasn't done. Not until I stood in the rubble and faced her. I stood on the edge of a victory that felt like a cliff. For 2 years, my entire existence had been defined by Patricia's downfall. I had mapped her life, learned her weaknesses, and engineered her ruin with the precision of a master architect. But in the process, the blueprint for my own life had been lost. David was right. The woman he fell in love with, the one who found joy in dusty books and old buildings, was gone. In her place was a strategist, a hunter. The cost of this war was being measured in pieces of my own soul. I had brought Patricia to her knees, but in doing so, I had learned to kneel myself, praying to a god of vengeance that only answered with silence and exhaustion. I had lost my sleep, my peace of mind, and very nearly, the man I was doing it all for. I had become a mirror image of my enemy, cold, manipulative, and obsessed with a victory that felt more like a sentence. But I wasn't done, not until I stood in the rubble and faced her. That moment of near defeat became my point of clarity. David's fear, his willingness to walk away for us, reminded me what I was truly fighting for. It wasn't just about punishing Patricia. It was about liberating David. It was about ending her reign so we could finally have a life that wasn't lived in her shadow. The hollow feeling in my chest didn't disappear. Instead, I accepted it. It became the fuel. The coldness was no longer a side effect of the mission. It was a necessary tool to complete it. I stopped questioning who I was becoming and focused on finishing what I had started. The final phase of the plan was the most delicate. The kill shot. Atherton Manufacturing was on life support. Its reputation was shot, its best clients were gone, and Arthur's secret embezzlement meant its financial foundation was pure sand. They were weeks away from insolvency, a fact that was about to become very public. The banks had cut them off. Their credit was gone. They were drowning. It was time to offer them a hand. My father, through a Cayman Islands-based private equity firm named Sterling North, made a formal offer to acquire Atherton Manufacturing. The name was a private joke between us, an inside reference she would never understand until it was too late. The offer was insulting. It was barely more than the value of their physical assets. It was a fire sale price that would leave them with just enough to pay their debts and escape total bankruptcy, but it would strip them of the company, the legacy, and the last vestiges of their wealth. It was an offer of survival, not salvation. As we predicted, Patricia's pride was the biggest obstacle. She was apoplectic. She saw the offer for what it was, a vulture circling a dying animal. But Arthur, who knew the truth of their financial ruin and lived in mortal terror of his fraud being exposed, saw it as their only way out. For the first time in their marriage, he stood up to her. David told me about the screaming match he overheard. Arthur laid out the grim reality. They had no choice. It was either accept this humiliating offer or face a catastrophic bankruptcy that would expose everything and leave them with absolutely nothing. He didn't mention his embezzlement, of course. He just painted a picture of utter ruin. Cornered and desperate, Patricia finally, venomously agreed. She would swallow her pride to survive. Her only condition was a face-to-face meeting with the principal of the firm that was buying them out. She wanted to look her conqueror in the eye. She wanted to salvage one last shred of dignity by negotiating some meaningless term in person. It was a pathetic final grasp for the control she had already lost. We granted her request. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday in a neutral territory, a soulless, glass-walled boardroom in a downtown high-rise that my father owned. The days leading up to it were the calmest I had felt in 3 years. The planning was over. The pieces were all in place. All that was left was to watch them fall. David and I talked for hours the night before. Not about the plan, but about the future. About the life we wanted to build, away from all of this. We promised each other that this would be the last day we ever gave Patricia Atherton any space in our lives, in our minds, in our marriage. We were a team, united and ready for the end. When we arrived at the building, we didn't go to the boardroom. We went to an adjacent office with a one-way mirror looking into it. We watched as Patricia and Arthur arrived. They looked smaller, diminished. Arthur was a ghost, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Patricia, however, had put on her armor. She was impeccably dressed, her hair perfect, her expression a carefully constructed mask of aristocratic defiance. She was determined to play the queen, even as her castle was being sold for scrap. They sat at the vast mahogany table, alone, for 10 minutes. The silence in that room must have been deafening. They were waiting to meet the man from Sterling North. They were about to. My father looked at me. "Are you ready?" I nodded. I felt no fear. No anger, no triumph. Just a profound, chilling sense of finality. This was the end of a story. The human mind is a fascinating thing. I watched in excruciatingly slow motion as Patricia's brain tried to process the impossible. I could see the sequence of her thoughts playing out on her face like frames of a film. First, confusion. What was I, the disgraced, worthless wife, doing here? And her son, standing with me, looking not ashamed but strong, defiant. Then the connection. Her eyes darted from me to my father, Richard Sterling. The name of his company. Sterling, my father. The quiet, modest family I came from. The pieces began to click into place, each one a hammer blow to her reality. The inexplicable business failures. The suppliers who vanished. The talent that was poached by a mysterious, well-funded competitor. The social ruin. The whispers. The declined credit card. It was all a coordinated attack. Finally, the full crushing realization. She looked from me, the strategist, to my father, the predator who had devoured her company. And then her eyes landed on David, her son. The co-conspirator. The traitor in her own house. That was the look that broke her. It wasn't the loss of the money or the company. It was the absolute betrayal. The knowledge that her own son had helped orchestrate her ruin. Her mask of defiance didn't just crack. It disintegrated. The color drained from her face. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She looked, for the first time since I had met her, truly and utterly defeated. She looked old. My father took his seat at the head of the table. David and I sat opposite her. "Patricia." "Arthur," my father said, his voice calm and level, holding all the power in the universe. "I believe you are familiar with my daughter, Jessica." Arthur just stared at the table, his face ashen. He knew it was over. Patricia's eyes, however, were locked on mine. They were filled with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. "You," she whispered, the single word filled with a universe of venom. I didn't say anything. I simply reached into my briefcase and pulled out a single thin file. I slid it across the polished table. It stopped directly in front of Arthur. The label on the tab read, AP Strategic Solutions. "Our due diligence was very thorough," I said, my voice as calm and quiet as my father's. "We found that the company's valuation has been significantly impacted by years of financial mismanagement. We have, of course, adjusted our offer accordingly. That was it. The checkmate. I had given Arthur a choice. He could let this acquisition go through, and his secret would be buried in the corporate restructuring. Or he could protest and my father would hand that file over to the authorities. We weren't just buying their company. We were buying their silence. We were buying his freedom from prison. Patricia stared at me, her mind finally grasping the full scope of her annihilation. She hadn't been defeated by a rival or brought down by market forces. She had been systematically dismantled by the quiet, worthless girl she had tried to erase. She had measured my worth in dollars and cents, and had failed to see my true assets: patience, intelligence, and a father who could move mountains for his daughter. She made one last, desperate attempt to wield the only weapon she had left. "David!" she choked out, her voice cracking, turning to her son. "How could you?" David looked at his mother, not with anger, but with a sad final pity. "You gave me a choice, Mother," he said, his voice clear and strong. "You told me I had to choose between my wife and my legacy. You were right. I chose." That was the blow that turned her to dust. She visibly deflated, all the rigidity and arrogance dissolving into a fragile, brittle shell. She had lost, and she knew that the whole world would never know the truth. She would live out her days as a cautionary tale, a fallen socialite, while the real story of her demise would remain our secret. A story told only in this room. We stood up to leave. We signed no papers. The lawyers would handle that. This wasn't a business meeting. It was a sentencing. As we walked to the door, I paused and looked back at her one last time. She was just a woman. A small, sad, broken woman sitting in the ruins of a life she had built on arrogance and cruelty. I felt nothing, no pity, no satisfaction, just quiet. The war was finally over. The aftermath was silent. Arthur and Patricia took the deal. They disappeared from public life, retiring to a small, respectable condo they could just afford, living out their lives in quiet, comfortable obscurity. The ultimate punishment for people who had lived their lives on a public stage. My father absorbed what was left of Atherton Manufacturing, restructured it, and managed to save most of the jobs, folding the viable parts into one of his larger companies. Arthur's secret remained buried. He got to keep his freedom, but he had to live with the knowledge that I owned it. David and I moved away. We bought a house in a small town by the ocean, a place where no one knew our names. He started a new company, a small one this time, built with his own hands and his own money. I started teaching architectural history at the local college. We built a new life, a quiet one, a real one. So the question that is always there, in the quiet moments before sleep, is this: was it worth it? I'd like to say yes. I'd like to say that I wake up every morning feeling vindicated, that I sleep the deep, untroubled sleep of the just. But the truth is more complicated. I destroyed Patricia. I took everything from her. I won, by every metric. But revenge is a fire that burns everything, including the person who wields it. It scorched me. It changed the very architecture of my soul. There's a coldness in me now that wasn't there before, a capacity for ruthlessness that I can never unknown. I didn't do it for the money or the power. I did it because someone had to hold a tyrant accountable. I did it because she drew a line and declared my life, my love, worthless. And I refused to accept her judgment. In that sense, it was worth it. We are free. David is free. He is the man he was always meant to be, unburdened by her expectations and her toxic legacy. Our love survived. It was tested by fire, and it survived. That is a victory no one can ever take from us, but revenge doesn't heal a wound. It doesn't restore what was lost. It simply cauterizes it, leaving a hard, ugly scar that will always be a part of you. It doesn't give you peace. It just gives you quiet. She thought my foundation was weak, that I was a poorly constructed addition to her grand design. But she was wrong. My father taught me that the strongest structures are built to withstand earthquakes. And what she never understood, what she could never comprehend, is that love. Love is a load-bearing wall. She tried to knock it down, so I brought her whole world down around her instead.